In this video, I address how the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were read in their Greco-Roman context. The short of it is, I think that the Gospels were read a variety of different ways, that they were different media, and they are self-aware of what kind of media they are. They tell us what kind of media they are, either at their beginning or at their endings. And these different kinds of texts, these different media, will have made for different kinds of reading events. This video largely represents in a different medium the argument of chapter 3 of my book, which is also titled Reading the Gospels, that concludes a section. It concludes part 1 on reading in Greco-Roman antiquity. In that chapter, I address and try to correct the myth that each gospel was written to be experienced the same way, that we sort of assume that all 4 gospels were the same kind of document that were read the same way. I argue instead that each gospel expresses its textuality differently. They indicate that they're different kinds of text, different media that made for different kinds of reading events. What we're going to do is go through the 4 different gospels. We're going to look at what they indicate about their media and compare that media with other similar media from other writers from the same Greco-Roman context. Each of the 4 Gospels labels itself in one way or another. 3 of them do so explicitly, saying what kind of text they are. One of them, namely Luke, does so a little bit more implicitly. And again, 3 of them do this at the beginning of their text, and 1 of them do it at the end of their text. So Mark 1:1, the beginning of the Gospel. I take Gospel as a media designation of what the document is that follows. Matthew calls itself a book, or biblos in Greek. Luke implies that it's a diegesis or account, but it doesn't expressly give this label to it. And it does this in a preface that is written to an individual who is named here, Most Excellent Theophilus. So Luke written to an individual reader. And finally, John in John 20:31 and also in John chapter 25 gives itself the label document. This is a biblion, which is close to the word Matthew uses, biblos, but it is not identical. What we're going to do is go through each one of these labels that the Gospels gives itself and compare it to other labels and other texts that are similar to them from other Greco-Roman writers. Beginning with the Gospel of Mark, which calls itself a gospel or euangelion. It's important for us to note that this term was not a literary term. It was not a term that referred to writings in the ancient world until Mark was written. That euangelion was, the word gospel meant orally proclaimed news. There was a close connection between something spoken and the word euangelion or gospel. And so we find that other authors talk about an overlap between a spoken tradition that is then put into writing and reactivated or reused or reperformed in different kinds of ways. So for example, Pliny the Younger tells us that his verses, his poems, are read and copied. They are even sung, so different ways of engaging them, reading them, copying them, singing them, and setting them to instruments, the kithara or the lyre, by Greeks who have learned Latin out of liking for my little book. So he says there are multiple different ways that his verses or his poems get experienced. He also says that his wife, and this is to her credit for Pliny, she copies out his works to read them again and again and even memorize them, to learn them by heart. And as with the first bullet point, she sets them to music and to sing and sings them. So different ways of engaging the same kind of text, sometimes read, sometimes sung. And then the last one, Pliny says, he's writing to a friend, you urge me to give a reading of my speech to a group of friends. I'll do it since you're asking me, but I have misgivings. I don't want to. I know very well that speeches, when they are read, lose all their warmth and spirit, almost their entire character, since their fire is always fed from the atmosphere, the biosphere, the communicative event of the court. Moreover, a man who is giving a reading has the two chief aids to his delivery taken up with his text. So it's not surprising if the attention of his audience wavers when there is no adventitious attraction to hold it nor stimulus to keep it aroused. So Pliny here is saying that he'll give a reading of this speech, but he doesn't really want to, because the speech is best experienced sort of in its original communicative context, which is sort of a courtroom context. And so the way this works for Pliny is he first writes the speech for the courtroom context, and then he delivers the speech without the writing present. So he doesn't actually look at the text when he delivers the speech in the live context, but he still has the written version of it. And he's saying that if you read from the speech, from the written version of the speech, if you actually have the document in front of you, it's a very different experience than the sort of oral context of the speech. So here we see sort of an overlap between the orality and literacy of the speech. They're different kind of events. The same tradition, the same text makes for different kind of events depending on the communicative context and how and if the text is or is not used in that context. The philosopher-physician Galen also talks about this overlap between oral speech and text on several different occasions. He says, on the inquiry you presented, Thrasybulus, a named individual, I have not said anything offhand that is different to what I have written in these notes. So he's saying what I've told you before in person, what I've spoken is the same thing that is written. There's an overlap between the speaking and the writing. In a different text, Affections and Errors, Galen says, you want a written version of the answer I gave you orally regarding Antonius the Epicurean's book on the control of the individual affections. I shall now make you one, and this is its beginning. He's saying, I've told you about this stuff. I've taught you about this stuff by speaking. You want a written version of it? Here's the written version, a written version of a spoken thing. And then a longer text here. Pliny is talking about sort of his own books and why they get plagiarized. He says, well, as for the fact of my books being published by many people under their names, my dearest Bassus, you know the reason for yourself. It's that they were given without inscriptions to friends or pupils, having been written with no thought for publication, but simply at the request of those individuals who had desired a written record of the oral lectures they had attended. When in the course of time, some of these individuals died, their successors came into possession of the writings, liked them, and began to pass them off as their own. Taking them from their owners, they returned to their own countries, and after a short space of time began to perform demonstrations in them, each in some different way. So again, Galen is saying, I would give these lectures, they would get written up by students, and then those writings would get out. He never sort of formally wrote them down himself by hand and tried to publish them, but there was an overlap between the oral demonstration and the written version that was given. So once again, we have an oral event, an oral teaching that is preceding the written version that has the same content, though in a different medium, one speech, one writing. So when we return to Mark with these texts in mind and knowing that euangelion means something written, there's a sense in which Mark is embedding the oral tradition in a written version, this sort of Russian nesting dolls idea of media, where every medium the content of one medium is another medium. So that when Mark says the beginning of the gospel, the orally proclaimed good news of Jesus Christ, he's saying this is the orally proclaimed news that has been spoken before, but now here it is in written form. When it comes to the Gospel of Matthew, in contrast, we have not a euangelion, but a biblos, a book. And if we think that Matthew is using Mark, which we do, given the synoptic problem, most solutions to the synoptic problem are going to have Matthew using Mark extensively. And here at the beginning of Matthew, we seem to have Matthew using the same sort of format for opening, even echoing Mark in the way that it opens, using Jesus Christ, son of someone. In the case of Matthew, it's going to be son of David, son of Abraham, whereas in the case of Mark, it's the son of God. But what Matthew has done has swapped out the oral word, euangelion, for a written word. a biblos, or a book. So Matthew decides to change Mark's oral designation to a written bookish designation. And when we look at some comparanda here, we're going to see what Matthew might mean by something that is bookish. And so some of the comparisons here are first going to be to Mark and also to Genesis. So whereas Matthew seems to echo Mark's beginning, Matthew 1:1 also seems to echo or resemble the beginnings of Genesis. Two different places in Genesis that say this is the book of the origin. Using that same word, biblos, and genesios, Genesis. So those are repeated in Matthew, Genesis 2, and Genesis 5, indicating that Matthew is sort of hooking itself to the preceding gospel tradition, the orally proclaimed gospel tradition that then exists in written form with Mark, but also to the scriptural past of Israel with respect to Genesis. And we find that this is very often how the term biblos gets used. It gets used to refer to scriptural documents. So actually when Matthew calls itself biblos, it sort of has really high aspirations. It's setting itself up as scripture, like scripture from Israel's past. So in the New Testament, on 5 different occasions where this word biblos or book is used, it's referring explicitly to what we would call Hebrew Bible, or what we would call scripture, the book of Moses, the book of Isaiah the prophet, the book of Psalms, or the book of the prophets. There's a couple other places that biblos is also used. It's used for the book of life in Philippians and Revelation. So 3 times it's the book of life. In Acts 19, there are Ephesians magicians who are burning their books. The same word, biblos, is used there. And then here in Matthew 1:1, we have biblos being used. And sort of the most likely connotation of those here, if we're sort of to place Matthew 1:1 with any of the other ones, it's most like the top one, reference to a scriptural text. Matthew is not referring to the book of life, and the sort of Ephesian magicians burning their books doesn't really have resonance for Matthew 1:1. So this sort of the connotation seems to be that Matthew is referring to itself as a scriptural text. And elsewhere outside of the New Testament, other Jewish authors, specifically Philo and Josephus, use this term biblos similarly to refer to scriptural texts. And they often append an adjective to the word book or biblos, and the adjective is holy, either with sort of a comparative or a superlative. More holy or most holy. So the holy books. So Philo, in a text called On the Cherubim, on the angels, says, which Moses wrote in the holy books. And then under that reference, I give you several other references where Philo does something similar. He uses books and holy together to refer to scripture, or the most holy books in the case of On the Life of Moses. Josephus does something similar. In the Antiquities, he says, I find these things written in the holy books. They run thusly, and then sort of repeats what is in the scriptures. And he does this not only with the quotation that I've given in this first reference, but many, many, many other times. So what we find in Philo and Josephus, like the main connotation of the term book in the New Testament, is that they use the term book to refer to a scriptural tradition. And so when we encounter the term book at the beginning of Matthew, sort of bells should go off for us that Matthew is associating itself with something that is scriptural. And this scripture makes for particular kinds of reading events. A different medium, different kinds of texts make for different kinds of reading. The main way to read scripture in Matthew's context was in a synagogue reading setting. So in a gathered group in which a scriptural text was read and then explained. So we find that this is the sort of normal mode, or one of the main modes. There are many different ways to read texts in antiquity. One of the main ways to read scriptural texts is by reading them in a synagogue setting with teaching accompanying that reading. And so when it comes to Matthew, this is the kind of reading event that I think Matthew would have made most naturally for. Reading short sections of of the gospel, sort of episodes or a couple chapters, and then that being explained in a communal setting. If Matthew seems to have in mind a communal setting for reading, Luke does something very, very different. So if communal is about the number of people, and Matthew has in mind multiple people in a synagogue reading setting, Luke addresses itself to an individual reader whose name is Theophilus, and it implies that it is an account, or in Greek, a diegesis. And what we have in the wider Greco-Roman culture and literature is texts that are in fact written to individual readers, and those individual readers sort of mattering or being the first readers of the texts, even if the text gets sort of distributed or circulated more widely after that first reader. So I'm going to read a couple of texts from the philosopher-physician Galen once again, in which he is addressing one single individual reader and thinks of that individual reader as his first reader. So in the beginning of On Exercise with the Small Ball, Galen addresses an individual reader saying how exercise with the small ball is a really, really great way to exercise. So he says, how great a good for health exercises are, Picanes, and that they must precede food was adequately stated by men of earlier times. So exercise is more important than food for Galen and others. Both the best philosophers and the doctors said this. However, the extent to which exercises with the small ball are superior to the other kinds of exercises has never been set out in sufficient detail by anyone previously. It is proper then for me to state those things I know, so they will be judged by you, a man best practiced in the art of these. If stated adequately, they will seem useful to you and will also be employed by others to whom you transfer this work. So we have sort of some echoes of what's going on with Luke here. Galen and Luke use the same kind of language, but they also write to an individual first with an eye to wider circulation after that individual first reads the text. Similarly, at the beginning of Method of Medicine, Galen says, since you, my dearest Hiero, have asked me many times, and certain other colleagues have done so as well, to write a method of medicine for you all, and since I especially want to oblige you all, and no less also made a choice to help those who will come after us as far as I am able, but have, however, been hesitating and delaying each time for many reasons, it seems to me better to go over those reasons now before I begin the treatise, as they do have some relevance about what is going to be said. So he says, people have asked me to write this. You have asked me to write it. I'm going to do it now. I'm going to tell you why I have been delayed. So again, we get the sense that it's first written for Hiero. Method of Medicine is first written for Hiero, but Galen also has an audience beyond that. And then in a different portion, a different section of Method of Medicine, it's sort of a multi-part work, really actually massive work. Galen addresses another individual reader, Eugenianus, and he says, I began to write Method of Medicine for Hiero, this person that's mentioned in the first preface. Then suddenly, Hiero was forced to spend a long time abroad. Soon after that, it was reported that Hiero had died, and so Galen abandons the project altogether. And then he takes it back up. For you know now that I wrote neither this nor any other treatise to advance my popular reputation. Rather, I write for friends. So Galen is saying in this sort of secondary preface to this book, Method of Medicine, I started this book for Hiero, and we see that in the first preface, and I'm continuing it for you, Eugenianus. So the individual readers, two of them in this case, Hiero in the first and Eugenianus in the second, are the initial readers of the work for Galen, even if they're going to be transmitted wider after those initial readers read it. And then finally, one more text from the philosopher-physician Galen. It's called De Indolentia, or sometimes translated On the Avoidance of Distress. So here Galen tells his reader, an individual reader, a friend, whose name's actually lost in this document. At the beginning of the text, the name is missing. He writes how he can avoid distress despite the problems that Galen has faced. And his specific problem is he lost a bunch of his written texts in a fire. But he multiple different times, I'm not going to read through each one here, he addresses the individual reader with a singular you, and sometimes addresses the sort of personal relationship he has with that individual reader. He'll say things that sort of like, we were brought up and educated together. So he's referring to things about that individual reader because this text is written for an individual reader first and foremost, and then may become a text that's more broadly circulated after that point. So Luke, written to an individual reader, and the last of the three synoptic gospels, with a sort of reference to what kind of document it is at its beginning. When we move over to John, the reference to the kind of document is at the end. It's biblion, in two different cases, in John 20:31 and in John 21:25. The reference in John 21:25 is not specifically to the Gospel of John, but it is John including itself within a group of documents. And so how I understand the term biblion, which is not the same as biblos or book, with which Matthew labels itself, is to be a more generic term for any written document. And so we see this in Josephus and Plutarch, where they use the term biblion to refer to a document or that is sort of nondescript about what kind of document it is. It's simply a written document. So Josephus, and Against Appian, says, let both this document and the preceding document be written for you, Epaphroditus, lover of truth par excellence, and likewise through you for those who wish to know about our people. So here Josephus is addressing an individual, and then the document is going to be circulated more widely, but he calls it simply a document. He doesn't say what kind of document it is, what kind of genre of text it is. It's simply a document. It's simply a written text. And the same thing, and even sort of more in stark relief, happens in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, the beginning of Life of Alexander, which is a biography of the great Alexander the Great, but also has with it a biography of Caesar. So two different biographies in one single document. And the preface that I have excerpted from here introduces both of those biographies that are contained in one single document or one single book roll or scroll, which was the common medium for literary texts in this context. So Plutarch says it's the life of Alexander the king and the life of Caesar who overthrew Pompey that I'm writing in this particular document. So this document contains two different discourses or two different books in one document. So here, biblion being a generic term. So that when John calls itself a biblion, it's saying this is a document, and it's not necessarily supplying what kind of document it is. And the reason I think for that is that it is because John knows the other Jesus documents. He knows the other Gospels, Mark's Evangelion Gospel, Matthew's book, Biblos, and Luke's account written to an individual. It's diegesis. And John is trying to make room for itself. When John says, if we were to write up all the deeds of Jesus, the world couldn't contain all the documents. John's saying, hey, there's room for me too here. I am a document that deserves to be read and experienced alongside of these other Jesus documents. And so the short of it here is that we have 4 different media labels for 4 different canonical gospels. Mark as gospel, Matthew as book, Luke as account, and John as document. And we should expect that different kinds of media were experienced different kinds of ways. Mark is very well experienced as an oral discourse that was put into writing, that it can sort of be used as a script for re-oral performance, whereas a book is best read either by an individual or aloud to a gathered group. An account written to an individual is sort of addressing a specific individual. And there's elements of the Gospel of Luke that suggest that throughout the Gospel, an individual reader is first in mind, and then only secondarily a wider circulation to a sort of more public audience. And finally, John does not necessarily give us a certain way, does not name its particular medium, but just says that it's a written document that exists amongst many other written Jesus documents.